Welcome to Manifold. My guest today is Rob Henderson. Rob has a very interesting personal history. He attended Yale University and is now completing a PhD in social and evolutionary psychology at the University of Cambridge in the UK. He has become well known, at least on the internet, as a kind of public intellectual. He coined a term, which we'll explore, called luxury beliefs. And he is a faculty fellow of the newly formed University of Austin, which is an attempt to recreate our broken woke university system in the United States. Welcome to the podcast, Rob.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation. And, normally I think of the podcast interview as an interview, but I feel like I really kind of know you because I've heard so many interviews with you and in which you've revealed aspects of your life story. So I almost feel like you don't know me, but I sort of feel like I'm your friend. So we're just going to have a conversation.
Yeah. I've had those kinds of interactions more and more, especially within the last 6 months or so after I went on Barry Weiss's podcast and Jordan Peterson's podcast. And both of those have, just a large audience. So now guys will come up to me, like I'll be working out in the gym and some young guy will come up to me and, just ask me about luxury beliefs or, just like ask, like he already knows me, and it's an interesting experience. It's to be in a position where someone knows a lot about you, and I don't necessarily know that much about them. And it's still something I'm getting used to. So, but I'm happy to talk about any aspect of my story here with you today.
Yeah, I having written a blog for a long time with a kind of niche following, I'm often in the situation where I meet somebody and I sort of find out he knows a lot about me or he or she knows a lot about me only later, or maybe they'll say it right up front. But the problem is that I'm never quite sure. Like, am I talking to somebody who has no idea who I am, or I'm talking to somebody who's like read like 1,000 blog posts that I've written or something? So that's the ambiguity.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's funny with me, like my girlfriend pointed this out, is that the strangers who will approach me tend to be like young guys, and especially young Asian guys. And she says that it's probably like younger Asian guys because they're better at telling Asian people apart. Number one, and number two, like if a white guy or white person sees me and they're not sure, like they don't want to risk offense. And so, there's like a selected pool of people who tend to approach me. Not that it's that many, it's like, once every few months or something. But yeah, there does tend to be like a certain type more often than not.
Yeah, you just hit on a very sensitive topic, which is that we all look alike to them.
Right.
And I guess that's kind of true because one thing I've noticed through my life is that I'll meet somebody for the first time and I'll be getting to know them and they'll say something, wow, do I know you? Have I met you
Oh,
before?
no.
And sometimes maybe they have met me before, but sometimes I think like, no, you have another Asian friend that you can't tell me apart.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
That's not an uncommon experience.
yep. So let's talk about your early life, which I think is very unique. And I think it informs I think you have a very insightful view of what's happening in American society. And part of it comes from having had a trajectory where you started out from, in a sense, very humble beginnings and now have reached some of the top institutions of higher learning. So maybe just tell us a little bit about your early life.
Yeah, I mean, like you'd mentioned at the start of the podcast, I'm currently finishing up my PhD at Cambridge, and before this, I studied at Yale. But before I entered these universities, my life was a lot different. So, just backing way up, I was born in Los Angeles, in poverty. I never knew my father. My mom became addicted to drugs, and when I was 3, I was placed into the foster care system in LA, and I bounced around different homes. I lived in 7 different homes over the course of the next 5 years or so. And yeah, I mean, that was a really difficult experience. Like my formative years, like just as I'm sort of forming consciousness and coming online as a human being, like every 6 months or so, I'm moving to a new home, new family, seeing my foster siblings come and go, sort of never knowing where I'm going to be next, or whether I wake up tomorrow and one of my foster siblings is taken from me. So that was really difficult. I was later adopted right around my 8th birthday, shortly before, by this family, and we settled in a kind of a dusty, like working class town called Red Bluff, California.
Can I jump in there for a second? So, in your earliest memories, do you remember your mother?
Yeah, I have a couple of very vivid kind of flashbulb memories of my mom. The earliest memory I have, I'm like literally, I'm at that point, yeah, 3 years old, like clutching my mom's lap. And these two, so as a kid, I'm just seeing these two guys in like just dressed in all black standing over us. And I instinctively know that like they're trying to separate us. And, now I'm aware these are police officers. And basically my mom was doing drugs, and guys were coming in and out of our apartment at all hours of the day and night, and one of the neighbors called the police, and they took a look around and immediately knew what was happening. And so that was my first memory. My second memory is of us sitting in a like this long white hallway, and I'm holding this carton of chocolate milk, and I sneeze and I spill it. And I look over at my mom for help, she's sitting next to me, but she can't do anything because she's wearing handcuffs. And like this recognition that like that she can't help me, I burst into tears. And then since then, so those are like the two memories that I'm pretty sure actually happened. I have these other like less vivid flashbulb memories of us living in a car. And like later I had these these documents now from my social workers who were responsible for my case, that we did live in a car in Westlake in LA, this kind of rundown neighborhood, before we moved to that apartment. But I'm not entirely sure like how accurate those memories are, because they would have been before that, but when I was 2 or something, and memories are especially unreliable that early. So those are my like sum total of my memories of my mom. I have zero memories of my father, who left us, I think, even before I was born. So yeah, then later on I was adopted, and my adoptive parents, they had a daughter. It was their birth daughter. She became my younger sister. And for a couple of years we had like a relatively stable family. And then my adoptive parents divorced, and my adoptive father was, he was angry at my mother for leaving him, and so he decided to stop speaking with me as a way to get revenge on her. And this was really difficult on me, which, it was difficult for my mom too to see that. And so, after not knowing my father, then all the foster homes, and then losing contact with my adoptive father, who by that point, like as far as I knew, he was my dad. I called him dad. I thought of him in that way. And so by that point, yeah, I was feeling extremely angry and betrayed. And yeah, I was just a really angry kid. My grades in school were plummeted, and just a lot of emotional turmoil that I didn't understand at that age. And yeah, that was a major reason why I was such a poor student at that time.
At this stage in your life, you're in Northern California, is that right?
Yeah, so Red Bluff is about 2 hours north of Sacramento. It's, I mean, the closest city or town that anyone may have heard of in that part of California is Chico, which is about 45 minutes away. So it's way up north, like closer to the like Oregon border than it is to San Francisco or the Bay Area. So it's pretty far up. And not a lot of people know about Red Bluff, but it is like it's the crime rates are especially high. The poverty rates are high. If you look at the rankings for like the highest crime rates in California, Red Bluff is consistently ranked around number 3 or number 4, usually right behind Oakland.
Yeah, I'm kind of familiar with like north of the Bay Area, California, because I used to be a professor at the University of Oregon,
Hmm.
and I used to run a startup in the Bay Area. So I used to go back and forth. Most of the time I would fly, but occasionally my wife or my girlfriend wanted to like drive because we were interested actually in that part of the country. The southern part of Oregon is really nice. It has California like climate and, beautiful trees, and there's a national park there called Crater Lake.
Hmm.
But yeah, when you get across the border into California, there's like almost nothing there, just some small towns. But the terrain is very beautiful, can be very beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is a gorgeous area. I mean, Mount Shasta's up there, Mount Lassen, a lot of greenery. At least, like, yeah, that a little bit further north of Red Bluff than that. Red Bluff itself is actually like extremely warm. The climate is dry. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, it was different. I mean, it was kind of a different environment compared to LA. I mean, I saw a lot of like the school system that I was in, the LA County foster care system, and the school system. There was a lot of poverty and drugs and crime and so on. I mean, I was a little kid, so didn't see like a ton of it, but I was aware of it by the time I left. And Red Bluff, it was kind of the same. It was just like, kind of almost like urban versus rural poverty. And in Red Bluff, I saw a lot of the same things. I mean, one difference that was interesting to me at first was that my like Red Bluff was whiter. I mean, Red Bluff itself is probably, I mean, it was, mostly white with like a sizable proportion of Hispanic students. Whereas the schools and my foster siblings in LA, it was like overwhelmingly Hispanic with some black kids, a few white kids, and like the occasional Asian kid, at least like the environments in the schools that I was in. So Red Bluff, it was like, mostly Hispanic, few white kids. Or yeah, oh, no, sorry. It was mostly white and then like some Hispanic kids and then like, a sprinkling of black and Asian kids. So it was that was like an interesting transition for me.
Did people often think you were Hispanic when you were really young?
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think people were confused or anything. I mean, there was like some like casual jokes and things about me being Asian, but none of it was like severe or like really bad or anything. I mean, the friends that I had, especially by the time I got to high school, it was like, my friend group, I had 5 guys. So out of my friend group of 5, there was one guy who was Hispanic and one who was half white and half Hispanic, and there was me and the rest of the guys were white. And so, yeah, I mean, race was not treated as a particularly big deal. Yeah, it just wasn't, at least the way that I recall, it wasn't a big thing.
Now, as you were going through all this process of foster homes and being adopted, were you ever given IQ tests?
Yeah, so but my final foster home, I was doing so bad in school. I mean, I was changing schools, like I said, like every 6 months, sometimes even more frequently than that. And so the state of California mandated that I take an IQ test. I think they were concerned that I had a learning disability or, some sort of, mental, challenges that prevented me from doing well. And so they sent this psychologist over and I took this test. I mean, I remember just being kind of annoyed that, I was out of school, right? I didn't want to have to like read and solve math problems. And it's just like this random woman who I'd never seen in my life, coming over and have to take these tests. And I scored below average. So I later on actually got the documents from my social worker and I scored below average overall. My reading score was really, I think my verbal IQ was, I don't know, it was like 83 or something like that. I mean, it was kind of a mess. I mean, my math score was relatively high. I think it was around like 117, and it was just like scattershot. And part of the reason for it was because I was like selectively motivated to answer the questions depending on whether they interested me and how much I cared in that specific moment. And yeah, it was, just the emotional turmoil led to just my scores and my engagement in academics in general to be very sort of haphazard and sporadic.
This is one thing that people often neglect is that motivation plays a role in terms of how well you score, whether the score reflects your actual ability. Later on, when you were in the military, I assume you probably had to take something like the AFQT.
That's right. Yeah. So when I was my final year of high school, I took the ASVAB when the AFQT, and yeah, I remember my recruiter. He pulled up these charts. He was giving my results, and he was like, "Oh, you can." He was just playing around his computer. He pulled up these charts, saying I could convert my results into an SAT score. And yeah, I noticed like, oh, that would have been like a really good score. And it was actually the same score as one of my high school friends who was going off to college. He was going off to Cal State Fullerton, but at least like as far as me and my friends were concerned, he was like the smartest kid we'd ever met, like a genius level kid. And so to see that my scores were, basically the same as his was really shocking to me because my GPA was extremely low. I think I had a 2.2 when I graduated. And I took like I intentionally tried to like get out of the classes they placed me in. They consistently placed me in the upper level courses, and I would like forge my mom's signature to get into like the lower level classes, right? So they put me in chemistry, and then I would go to my high school advisor or counselor and say, "Oh, I want to take a nutrition science instead of chemistry." And he would say, "Oh, your mom has to fill out this form." And I'd go home and just sign it and come back. And then I'd, get out of chemistry and take these easier courses. And even then, I barely passed because I never did homework and barely paid attention in school.
Now, why did they though initially place you in the higher level courses?
I think on the strength of my grades and test scores from middle school. So my early life was just a series of reversals where, I had mentioned before my adoptive parents splitting up and my grades plummeting and not doing so well. And then my mom met a woman named Shelly. They formed a relationship. They bought a house together and raised me and my sister. My sister would move every other week with between her dad and our mom. And so those years from around like 9 or 10 to about like right before high school to like 14, those were the years that I recall being like sort of the most stable and the most sort of satisfying and warm in my early life. And so those were like my middle school years essentially. And so I actually did pretty well. I got like mostly A's and B's, and did well on my test scores, and yeah, was a pretty good student. I had the capability to be a decent student if, the things around me were generally going okay. But then right before I started high school, Shelly was shot, and that just sort of put my home life into a tailspin, and you know really affected me. So then my performance in high school suffered as a result of that. So yeah, I was sort of almost like responsive to how chaotic and disorderly was my surroundings, and my sort of general attitude towards people and towards school and everything, was a reaction to that.
It it's kind of interesting that you very nonchalantly say that your mom's partner was shot, and like without elaborating. I mean,
I mean,
was that
yeah, it was just a crazy accident. I mean, they were at a shooting range with some of their friends, and one of their friends, her weapon jammed, and she was attempting to, unjam it and figure out what was going on, and she was carelessly, aiming it around, and yeah, it misfired and hit, my mom's partner, Shelly, in the back. And yeah, so she had to go through a series of extensive surgeries and treatments and physical therapy, and she ended up surviving. But there were, early on we weren't sure, and then we weren't sure if she was going to be able to walk again. And so, yeah, and then on top of that, on top of just the challenges of her injury and trying to recover, there were financial difficulties, and because Shelley was no longer able to work, and so the bills were piling up, and that added another layer of stress in our house, and just kind of threw everything off. And so yeah, it was tough for me. It was tough for my sister. I noticed, around that time my sister stopped visiting as much. She mostly stayed with her dad, and in high, like at the time, I wasn't entirely sure why. I mean, it was, we talk on the phone a lot, but now I sort of realize like she probably sensed what was happening in the home and wanted to just sort of withdraw from it. And at that point, I mean, I was kind of withdrawing from it and spending more and more time with my friends by that point. I mean, I was 14. And so generally that's the age when, kids sort of take on this rebellious attitude and start sort of testing boundaries. And, on top of that, there's like puberty and all the hormonal changes. And so even in like the best of circumstances, that's sort of a transitionary period for any kid. But then on top of everything I had been through, and then the situation at home just sort of amplified everything and dialed it up even more.
right? So this is a pretty tumultuous time for you, high school, and it sounds like you weren't interested in school very much. So when you were hanging out with your buddies, what were you guys mainly doing?
I mean, mostly just like the dumbest, dumb things you could think of. I mean, at that point, we were smoking a lot of weed. We were taking pills. I mean, we would take like generic Vicodin, but we would also, at this point, we like learned that you could take cold medicine, like large doses of Sudafed and some of these other pills. And if you took like 10 of them in a row, like DXM, you'd basically get like a pretty good high. We'd play the choking game, which I don't know if you're familiar with this. I mean, it's like basically this game where you like cut off oxygen to your brain by pressing the carotid arteries in your neck. And what else? I mean, we were getting into
Well,
fights, drinking and driving, vandalizing buildings. I mean, it got pretty out of hand. I mean, there were some close calls. I mean, fortunately, like I can't recall any like specific like life or death situations, but it was a lot of just like recklessness and irresponsibility. And later on, one of my good friends, his younger brother tried to join a gang, and he was shot to death. Like they killed him because they were when he was trying to join the gang, they had to play Russian roulette, and he failed, yeah, or whatever. Like he got, he got the barrel of the gun, and they killed him. And so those kinds of things like those stories were not uncommon at my high school where I was growing up. And so Yeah, I mean, all around me was like this. So, I had my childhood with the foster care system and everything else, but like all of my friends were raised by single moms. One of my friends was raised by his grandma because his dad was in prison and his mom was hooked on drugs. And, other friends raised, just all these kind of like, what do they call them? Like alternate family arrangements or something where nobody I knew was raised by both of their birth parents. And so, yeah, it was a lot of sort of, in addition to like the sort of whatever lower middle class or working class kinds of poverty, there was just a lot of like dysfunction too.
So when you decided to join the Army,
The
was
Air
it
Force, it was the
main
Air Force.
I'm sorry, the Air Force. Was it mainly to get out of your situation, or did you have some actual goal within the Air Force that you wanted to
I
achieve?
had no specific goal other than get out of there. So I was 17 when I enlisted. I had to talk my adoptive mother into signing some documents to let me go. So you can join when you're 17. You can enlist at 17. You just need parent or guardian signature. So yeah, right after high school, I talked my mom into signing them, and so yeah, but my only goal was just to get out of there, get out of Red Bluff, get away from everything. It seemed like every few years, just another tragic or severely upsetting event happened. So yeah, I remember even, like, talking to my recruiter, and I was like, "I don't I was like, "Whatever job." I mean, I whatever even the Air Force, the only reason I did that was because one of my teachers was in the Air Force, and one of my friends' dads was in the Air Force, and they were like, "Oh, yeah, you should, join if you're gonna join the military, join the Air Force." I'm like, "Alright, I'll join the Air Force." It was, like, not a ton of thought put into it. And then, yeah, I just wanted to get out of there, and I had some inkling in the back of my mind that maybe someday I could go to college. That was something I think that attracted me probably as far back as middle school, back when I was doing pretty well in school, but I never really saw myself on that track. I knew my grades were bad, but I knew a part of me thought, well, maybe this could be a path out of here. And the recruiter, one of the main incentives they try to use to recruit kids out of high school is the GI Bill, which pays for tuition and provides a living stipend. And so he was talking that up a lot, and I thought, oh, maybe someday. Especially once he showed me my test results and how well I had performed, and I thought, well, maybe someday I can give this a shot. But for now, I just need to get out of here.
Now, did the test results open the door to a good specialty already at that time for you in the Air Force?
Yeah, so my recruiter told me I qualify for basically every job available, and so there was like a variety of jobs that looked pretty mundane, like security forces, or I don't know, just like a lot of jobs that didn't seem particularly interesting. But yeah, the job that I chose, it was electronic warfare systems. And that was, just the because it had the name warfare in it, and I was 17, I was like, "Oh, electronic warfare, what's that?" And there was a lot of like technical jargon in the description, but essentially what I did later, once I trained and everything, was repairing radars and missile warning systems, anti-heat seeking missile systems, those kinds of things. And so it opened me up to do that. It was a technical job, and I had to go through two different phases of training. I mean, right after basic training in Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, I went to Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi, and then I had follow-on training at Shepherd Air Force Base. So it was like a lot of training, a lot of going to different bases just to sort of gain the skills necessary. And then once I got to my duty station, it's almost like anything else where I get there and they're like, "Yeah, forget everything you learned in your training. Like, here's how the job's actually done." And then it was like another year of training from there, like on the job training. So it was a lot of yeah, it was a lot of sort of building the skills necessary to do that. Unlike being a military cop or something like that, where maybe the training isn't quite as intense.
So do you know your way around like a voltmeter and oscilloscope, stuff like that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a little bit. I mean, I'd forgotten a lot of it by now, but yeah, I mean, I know I'm somewhat familiar with like all that stuff. We took electronic principles and shooting wires and those kinds of things.
And how are you with an AR-15?
You know, I don't think we ever actually used AR-15s. We trained with
M4s?
M16s,
Steams, yeah.
M16s and M9s in basic, and then we had to qualify whenever we deployed, and I deployed twice. So yeah, the Air Force is, it's sort of it's not the most, it's not like infantry, right, or the Marines or something. It's like we have to sort of know the basics, but it's not a key part of the occupation the way it is like for the Marines, right? They're like riflemen first. The Air Force, it's like as long as you sort of know the basics of a weapon, then that's all they care about.
I find it funny that because I grew up in Iowa hunting and stuff like this, and I have guns. When I mention that to any other professor, their eyes bug out. Like, you have an AR-15? What? You know. So,
Yeah, I
uh,
have like these pictures. I'll go out with my friends sometimes when I go back home, and we'll go to the shooting range or something. We'll take pictures, and I'm like, I don't know if I put these on Instagram and all my academic colleagues are going to see this, they'll freak out. So I'm like, I try to be careful with like, how much of my familiarity with gun culture that I post online.
I was blogging about it at one point, and I said something like, I got to teach my kids this stuff as just a basic life skill, and people freaked out. They're like, "What? Handling guns is a basic life skill?" And I was like, "What else is a basic life skill? I mean, other than learning how to like choke a guy out with jujitsu and fire a gun."
Oh man, yeah, I'm sure they love that.
Yeah. But anyway, so you're in the Air Force, and are you stationed in Germany, in Europe?
Yeah, so okay, I was first stationed in McCord Air Force Base in Washington State. Now they merged with the military base Fort Lewis since I'd left. But yeah, so I was in Washington State first. Then I was stationed in Germany at Bramstein Air Base and did a couple of deployments. So I was in Qatar at Al Udeid. I was in Kyrgyzstan at Manas Air Base. And yeah, I spent a couple weeks in Italy, and yeah, I was just kind of spent most of my enlistment actually was abroad in Europe and the Middle East.
And was this sort of, the standard description is young man leaves his small town in America and sort of sees the world through the military and maybe through the eyes of the other enlisted men or even officers that you're spending time with.
Yeah, I mean, I met a lot of good friends and sort of yeah, it was an illuminating experience meeting people from all over the country, all over the world, just like recognizing like the diversity of interesting perspectives and experiences people had. I mean, one thing that was kind of interesting to me was when I was in basic training, I realized like just I guess my impression was that I would just meet a bunch of people like me who were just like right out of high school, sort of aimless and lost and maybe didn't have like the best home life. But it wasn't really like that. I mean, I met guys who, of course, like had similar experiences to me, but I met, guys who already had bachelor's degrees and people who were a little bit older. I mean, the oldest guy that I knew at basic training was training whether he was no, I was 17. He was 27 years old. So he was 10 years older than me. And he'd already like, to me, like, he was like he'd already lived life, like 27 years old. Wow, like tell me what you know. And he would like tell us about college and about, what it was like to, I don't know, just like move away from home and study and like all his plans and everything. And so it just helped me to mature and helped me to understand that, the possibilities that I thought that I had were, they were broader. They were broader. There was more out there that I could accomplish, could achieve. And so yeah, it was yeah, in many ways, yeah, that experience, I was really grateful, even though I didn't quite understand what I was getting myself into, and there was a lot of, like, periods of misery and unhappiness and so forth, but generally speaking, it was probably the smartest decision I'd ever made.
No, when you were in high school, I'm guessing you didn't really buy into the system, but when you got to the military, did you sort of buy into it and say like, well, this is maybe it's structured in too rigid a way, but at least there is a system here that I can understand and I can operate in, and it's somewhat fair or something. Did you get to that point of view?
Yeah, I don't know if I was quite that sophisticated in my thinking at that time. I mean, I generally, I don't know if I thought in terms of like the system, but I thought in terms of like adults and rules and those kinds of things, and I thought they were ridiculous. And I didn't really take it that seriously. I mean, one of the reasons I even joined, I had this sort of what disagreeable kind of personality where I would tell people I was joining, like I would tell adults, like my mom's friends or something, or teachers, that I was planning to join the military, and they'd like react with horror because this was 2007, and this was the height of the Iraq War and Afghanistan, and this sort of at this point the sentiment against George Bush, even among Republicans, was turning, right? Like, this was like right before Obama came on the scene, and like people just wanted to just forget all about Bush and the wars and everything. And so, yeah, there were a lot of teachers like, "What? Why would you do that? You're gonna get killed. This is terrible." And to me, I was like, "Good. Like, if you don't like it, then I'm gonna do it." It just made me want to do it even more. And then, yeah, the military experience. It was at first, like basic training and everything. All that stuff sucked, but that was like the first time in my life that I really felt like this sort of respect for rules in the system, and that I understood that, I mean, the military is a very unique environment where, up front, right? Like right away, you're sort of, yeah, you're learning how to shoot M16s and M9s. Like literally, these are life and death situations. Even things like repairing radars and missile warning systems. Like if you fail to perform your tasks, people can actually die. And so the gravity of the situation hit me, and I realized like, oh, these rules are in place for a reason. And even just like the camaraderie and seeing like guys I respect that structure, probably, that rubbed off on me too, and had an impression on me. And the basic training instructors and stuff, like they were well aware of like, oh, these are a bunch of like dopey young guys, and like they make jokes about like, I know 2 weeks ago you were jacking off on your mom's couch, but those days are over. And like, get on your face, and it's like, let's do push-ups for the next 2 hours while I like insult everything about your appearance. And like, there was, but that sort of shared misery. Yeah, I mean, there's something strangely enjoyable about it.
When I was in high school, I loved movies like, this is dating me, of course, but like Officer and a Gentleman or Taps or, stuff about the military life. And my brother and I both actually thought about applying to the service academies, which I would have probably hated had I gone there, but we were seriously thinking about it.
Yeah, it's one of those things
So
where you're in it and you hate it, and then like as soon as you're out of it, there's like this immense sense of relief, and then for the rest of your life, you just laugh about it. Like that's sort of my impression of like talking to other guys too. Is like, it's like a memory that you laugh about because it was so, so unpleasant.
so at some point while you were on active duty, you decided you were going to apply to college. Is that right? And somehow you actually applied to Yale.
Yeah, that was a weird transitionary period. I mean, I had no idea what the process was of even going to college. I, I taken some night classes. I mean, this is sort of how I guess unfocused I was. I took night classes at a local community college when I was, I think, 18 or 19. One of the classes I took like writing composition, or it was like English 101, one of those like very basic, low level kind of classes, like intro courses. And I think I got a B in it, or a B plus. And I actually like, I think I, as the way I recall it, I actually put in some effort and I tried to pay attention. I probably didn't go about it the right way. And yeah, I mean, getting a B in a community college writing class is not necessarily the sign of someone who's going to go to Yale later. But I was just such an undisciplined kid, and I had no idea like how to actually study and focus for material at that level. And so yeah, fast forward, I'm like 24 years old. My enlistment's about to end, and I was just like on doing online searches for like how to get into college. Eventually I found this program called the Warrior Scholar Project, which is, yeah, a program designed to help veterans get into college and then succeed, sort of improve their academic skills that may have become rusty, throughout their military enlistments. So I managed to get into that program, and it was 2 weeks, and it was sort of a crash course in, here's how to fill out a Common App, and here's how to get recommendations, and here's how to write a college essay. And then, once you're in college, here's sort of the expectations. And here's, I mean, even though like the most basic things, like here's what the purpose of office hours is when a professor offers them. Here's what, the kinds of questions that are appropriate to ask. So it was like, very much hand holding throughout, like people, for a lot of people, none of us had ever, considered college before. So
Eh,
it was very helpful.
This was a
Mhm.
program run by the military with maybe civilian instructors, or how?
No, 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 no. So this was started actually by two students at Yale, surprisingly enough. So one of them was in the Marine ROTC program at Yale. He played football and he injured his back in the Harvard Yale football game. So he was disqualified from service. So he still wanted to sort of be involved with military in some way. So he started it with a guy who's actually an Australian military vet, and they started this program, and now it's at like multiple campuses across the US. But at that point when I was in, they had a workshop at Yale, a workshop at Harvard, and a workshop I think at the University of Michigan. And it was just random, like where like if you applied and you got in, they just like assigned a campus to you. And I just happened to have gotten into the 2 week workshop at Yale. And while I was there, I was like, oh, I wonder if I could go to a school like this. And I would sort of cautiously bring it up, tepidly bring it up with the instructors there, who were either Yale students. Well, the tutors were Yale students at the program, and the instructors were actually, some of them were Yale professors. Like John Gaddis ran some of the seminars. Charles Hill taught a seminar. We had writing instructors who were also like, Yale lecturers. And I would bring this up with them, like, I'm thinking about maybe applying here next year as an actual student. And they were very encouraging. I was surprised. And so that was, sort of at the beginning of my plan to actually seriously apply for Yale. And yeah, I actually managed to get into to my surprise.
Did you apply to multiple schools or just Yale?
Yeah, yeah, I applied to multiple, but my sights were set on Yale. I mean, really just because of that 2-week experience. I didn't really have, strong preferences for like what the other schools I wanted to get into were. I mean, I applied mostly to top tier schools. I was, even in this case, I was a bit irresponsible because I had no backup plan. Like it's entirely within the realm of possibility that I I wouldn't have got into any of them, and I didn't know what I was going to do if I didn't. And so yeah, it was all, at the time I didn't know this term, but they were all quote like reach schools, no what's like safeties or what match schools or anything. It was all reach schools, and I got into a couple of others, but I really wanted to get into Yale. And yeah, I managed to get in for the fall term of 2015.
And why do you think you got in? Was it because of your unique story, or was it because of your high SAT score or your essay? What do you think made them?
Yeah, probably all of it. I mean, I by that point I had built up like I cobbled together like a year's worth of night classes at community college, and yeah, by that point I think I had like mostly A's, maybe one or two B's. I had a really good SAT score. I took the SAT at a high school in Ramstein Air Base, Germany. So there's a high school on the base for like, like the sons and daughters of like the high ranking officers and like some of the older senior NCOs. So there's actually like an American high school on the military base, and they offered the SAT, and I remember showing up there at like 7:45 a.m. and it was like, a bunch of 16 and 17-year-olds and then me, and I felt extremely awkward, man. Like I had to go to this high school class with like, the desk had one of those tiny little desks attached, and I tried to like squeeze in there like, damn, these desks are smaller than I remember. And I just felt like super self-conscious being in that environment with all these kids. But then like realizing, oh, like my classmates aren't going to be that much older than them. They're going to be 18. Like they're not that much older than me. And it was, realizing like, oh, I'm going to be, like this old guy in the class, like a mature student. So that was probably it. And I had good recommendations, I think, from my community college professors. I had one letter from one of the Yale instructors at the Warrior Scholar Project. And yeah, my unusual background, my college essay, I think probably also played a pretty big role.
At this stage, you're 24, 25 by the time you get on campus?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm how old am I at that point? I think I'm 25, 2015, right? So 25, yep.
Right. So it's funny because I lived in one of the Harvard houses, Dunster House, which is one of the river houses, when I was a postdoctoral fellow. I was a Harvard junior fellow after my PhD at Berkeley,
Hmm.
and I was 24, and I was just a little bit older than the kids, but I just enjoyed it. It was like going to college again because I would eat in the dining hall with the kids and hang out with the tutors and the kids, and it was like college is better if you're a little bit older than the other kids because you kind of know what the whole thing is about, and you can kind of just enjoy the atmosphere more. And I wonder if you had that feeling at all.
Yeah, I did in the sense that like I had maybe more of a sense of purpose. I knew why I was there. I wasn't just sort of ticking the next box. I mean, and the other part of it was just like the feeling of awe that I managed to get in there at all. I mean, I knew a lot of, and I became friends with a lot of students there too. And like I recognized that a lot of these students, they trained their whole lives to get into a place like Yale, right? Like, kids who go to Andover and Exeter and like, just they were on that track to get into a school like that. And so it seemed like for many of them, it was just like one more box on the way to law school or medical school or whatever sort of lucrative career. Whereas for me, it was like, how did I get in here? It was like the first couple of weeks was just a feeling of amazement. And then, yeah, the classes and yeah, just generally it was better. I mean, I think the entire time I was at Yale, I may have missed one or two classes, whereas like I knew, especially for lectures, students don't go to class, especially nowadays with even pre-COVID, professors would put all the slides online, students would share notes with everybody. But I was like so grateful and so serious about doing as well as I could that yeah, I went to every class possible and yeah, maybe missed once or twice. So Yeah, it was as an older student, there's definitely a difference in I think in terms of like, at least for me, my perspective and how seriously I took the whole experience and yeah, the education and everything.
And what was your impression of the level of the courses, the challenge, and the seriousness of the students around you?
It was so let's see. I got there. I mean, I got there in September. So for the first like 8 weeks I was there, I was very impressed with the students, with the level of the coursework. I mean, I struggled honestly for that first semester. I remember it was pretty difficult for me to keep up with everything just because, I'd been such a poor student in high school and it had been, several years since then. And, yeah, I took that 2 week workshop, but that was, 2 weeks can't really make up for years of bad habits. So, I befriended a lot of the students and they would just teach me like very basic study skills. I mean, spaced out repetitions and like, pulling up the slides and, trying to match them with the notes and just like all this very basic stuff that I just like, didn't even occur to me. And so, going to like these study sessions and stuff really helped. The classes, the professors, just everything about it was extremely enjoyable. And it was really like yeah, just the contrast between that and the military. By that point, I mean, I was so ready to get out of the military and to be in an environment where like it was all about sort of learning and curiosity was, yeah, just incredible. I'll never forget like those first few weeks that I stepped on campus, but then things
Would you say
changed.
by the would you say by the end of the first year, you were pretty confident that you could compete on equal terms with the other kids there?
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. So I mean, as an example, I took a like my first semester, I took a cognitive science class, and so I had never before read any kind of scientific paper in my life, and this class was assigning like multiple per week, and I had no idea how to even read one. I didn't even know like the basics of like what an abstract was. That's like how naive I was. And so I like the midterm, I remember they put the scores broken down by quartile or something on the slides, and I saw mine and I was like, in the bottom quartile. I was like, I started to have these doubts, like, do I really belong here? And, I then that was when I started to attend study sessions and ask students and ask for help, going to office hours and all of those things, and just sort of filling in the gaps in my knowledge and habits and skills. And then, yeah, by the end, I did very well in that course. And then by the end of the first year, yeah, I was fairly confident. I think like my intellectual ability was probably always there, but it was just sort of weighed down by the, very unusual and chaotic experiences of like my entire life up to that point. And the military helped with like sort of, I mean, one thing the military did was like taught me like, you should ask for help, have structure, have a routine, build good habits, those kinds of things. But I just had to know like how to do that in the academic environment as opposed to the military one. And so, yeah, by the end of the first year, it was all sort of coming together.
And I'm guessing overall you did well there to be admitted to Cambridge for graduate school.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I did well. I, did well. Got a good grades. Did well on the GRE, and yeah, I think like everything was fine. Got good recommendation letters, and yeah, I mean, I made the most of the experience and took it as seriously as I could. And very much the opposite of my attitude in high school. And I was a research assistant in a psychology lab and spent a lot of time doing that. Sort of helping to run participants in studies, and I was working in a developmental psych lab, and so we would go to like schools, we would go to the museums, and just sort of have kids like play these games on iPads, and basically these were sort of studies in disguise. And I did an internship at Stanford before my senior year, so I was out there in California, which was nice because my family wasn't too far away from me by that point. So yeah, I worked in the Department of Psych at Stanford and worked at the Bing Nursery School there. And yeah, I sort of threw myself into that environment and really was set on going to grad school and sort of continuing in psychology.
Now, because you were older, were you dating older students at the college, or how did that work? Were you more, you felt like more in common with the grad students than the undergrads? How did it work?
Yeah, I mean, it was so the first year there. I mean, it was difficult because the people that I got along with were like the older undergrad, like seniors essentially, right? Because I was 25 and they were 21 or 22, so like I could speak with them. I just could not hold conversations for very long with actual freshmen. I mean, they're just kids. But then, they left, right? They graduated that first year, and then I was like, "Oh, like, most of my friends are gone," and so it was hard. I mean, I ended up befriending some grad students. One of my best friends now, he was a student there. He was in the Marines, and he sort of had a somewhat similar path to me, and he was a little bit of an older student too, so he and I became good friends. Yeah, and then, yeah, with dating, I mean, I dated, she was a master's student at the Yale School of Public Health, and yeah, we were together. And so, yeah, I guess, like, I ended up, like, finding friends and girlfriends and whatever just from, like, people who were slightly older, maybe a little bit closer to my age. And yeah, I mean, it was like a little bit challenging at first, but once I sort of had my social circle and my peer group and, started dating and everything, it was yeah, it was fine.
When I was there, I remember Payne Whitney is at the gym.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right.
it was pretty run down, and I was the faculty advisor to the judo club, and we actually started I started the Brazilian jiu-jitsu club at
Oh,
Yale. I don't
nice.
know if it's still running, but I think they remodeled the whole thing. Probably by the time you got there, was really probably pretty swing.
What years were you there and how long?
I was there as an assistant professor from around 94 to 97.
Ah, okay,
And I
gotcha.
moved to Oregon. So you were just a little kid when I was.
Right. Yeah, so at that time, how was New Haven in the mid-90s? Was it okay? What was your impression of the city?
It's funny. I could go into a long conversation with you about that. I'm very curious about it because when I was there, it was pretty nasty. I mean, outside campus, it was nasty.
Hmm.
I live on Whitney Avenue toward. There's a park that's something rock. It's got a big. Gosh, it's just. I think it's what direction was that? North of camp. Well, toward away from main campus toward the Science Hill, and you just keep going on Whitney Avenue. East Rock Park. I can't remember the name
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the park,
East
but
Rock, that's right. Oh, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So I lived like just a few blocks, maybe half a mile toward East Rock Park from the physics building.
I see.
And I was a fellow of Silliman College.
Hmm.
Probably residential college. That's the closest one to the Science Hill.
Mhm, mhm.
And I enjoyed it. I liked it. I mean, I had a pretty good social life, but the area was pretty nasty. And I remember like sometimes if I was taking the bus to the airport, like I was going to like I forgot my JFK, when the bus would stop at like Bridgeport or so. There were some really nasty areas that
Oh,
just
yeah.
very close to Yale that you didn't really want to spend a lot of time there necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, I mean, my understanding is, like, it got a little bit better. They sort of, the situation improved, but even, when I was there, yeah, it was still pretty rough. I mean, I lived on Chapel Street, right in downtown, and to get back to my apartment, yeah, I had to walk through the green, and there's just, like, a lot of poverty and mental illness and, addiction and so on, and it was really, yeah, it was a very sharp contrast, walking from, like, these ivory towers at Yale to, going back down, going through the green and seeing, like, downtown New Haven and just the situation of what was happening. And so, yeah, that was, I mean, yeah, the dynamic, I think, between Yale and New Haven, that is, very interesting. And I sometimes wonder, like, how much that plays into, a lot of the campus politics.
It's interesting, a lot of the Harvard kids are unhappy. Like you talk to them later and they complain about their Harvard experience. And at least in the era when I was around, the Yale students all seemed to really like it. And I think partly it was because there isn't that much more than the campus, so it tends to be a little more inwardly focused. Like your whole world is Yale University, whereas Harvard is next to Boston, and there's just more stuff. And
Hmm.
so people would, I just found the Harvard students more likely to complain about their college experience and Yaleys all seem very happy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think maybe, like, that's true. Yeah, I think that generally speaking, I've spoken to a few Harvard students and grads too, and it does seem like Yaleys have this, more of an affinity for the college and for the campus, and yeah, and I wonder if, yeah, if that's a part of it, right? Because few students venture off campus, right? They stay very much in the Yale bubble, and there's, yeah, I could see them, because sometimes I could, I'd walk off campus with some of them and hang out or whatever, and I could see them like steel themselves, like, oh, going into New Haven, and they many of them would have much preferred to stay on campus.
Yeah, I think my impression is that, maybe some areas right just adjacent to the university are kind of cleaned up and gentrified, but I don't think the university can really fix the town. So I
Yeah.
think it's not going to be solved anytime soon.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And every once in a while, I think the students use it against one another. I think too about how bad New Haven is and how they should do something about it, or how the administration should do something. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure that's going to be like a quick fix solution.
Now, were you there when the Christakis Christakis incident happened at Silliman?
Yes, I I was there. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, I brought this up earlier. Like, the first 8 weeks, it was, it was an extremely enjoyable experience. And then when that happened, my entire sort of impression of Yale was permanently altered, like to this day, because I think probably because of the extreme contrast of what it was like and then what it had become. Yeah. I mean, I
That
wasn't
was your
actually
freshman year.
that was my, yeah, freshman year, my first year. That was the fall of 2015, the infamous Halloween costume controversy, as many people now know it. I wasn't actually in the Silliman courtyard, but I was, aware that, this email had caused some discontent, and that the students were upset. And then I saw, hundreds of students marching around campus with a list of demands, with their megaphones, calling for Erica and Nicholas Christakis to be fired. The conversations on campus, always revolved around what was happening there and how they should be fired. And there were like pockets of students who were, quietly dissenting or speaking reasonably about it, but the dominant feeling on campus was like, President Salovey needs to respond to this and something has to be done.
So was that whole kind of woke zeitgeist totally alien to you coming from the military, or had you already experienced some of these things in the military before you went to Yale?
I mean, it's like not at all. I mean, it's funny. The months leading up to when I was, transitioning to Yale out of the military, I would occasionally so I mean, one of the things I picked up from that experience, the Warrior Scholar Project, those 2 weeks and that workshop at Yale, was, like, I would ask, like, what can I do? What should I be reading? Like, what, just basically, like, what are things I can do to prepare after I leave this program? And, they like say things like, oh, you should read The Atlantic, or you should read The New Yorker, you should keep up with sort of current events in education and so on. And so I'd like, I'd never read The Atlantic before in my life. I never read the New York Times. Like, I just, keeping up with media stuff was not a part of my like cultural outlook. And so I would read it. I'll go to the Atlantic, like, oh, here's something about universities. And it was like, that was like the beginning of like, oh, snowflakes and free speech debates. And I didn't quite grasp what it was. And, it was just sort of like alien to me. And then I get on campus and it wasn't like that. Those first 8 weeks, like I felt like like none of that social pressure, no wokeness, at least that I could tell. I mean, maybe it was there and I was just blind to it. I remember, this must have been, I don't know, about a month into that, my first semester. Jonathan Haidt came to. I saw flyers. Jonathan Haidt was coming to campus to give a talk, and I had just read *The Righteous Mind*, and I was a big fan of his work in moral psychology. And so, I went to this talk, and I assumed it was going to be about the book and about his research in moral psychology. And instead, he gave this, like, at least to me at the time, what I considered to be a very strange talk, which was about, like, the aims of a university and whether it should be truth, whether it should be equipping students with the ability to pursue knowledge, or should it be about protecting feelings and sensitivity and, all the things that we're sort of familiar with now. But at that time, it was just totally, it was like gibberish to me. Like, what is this about? And then, like, a month after that was when, the protest kicked off. And I thought back, like, oh, that's what that was about. And then it all sort of clicked for me that, like, oh, that's like, this isn't the universe. I'm not at the place that I thought I was. I'm not where I thought I was. These people are different than what I expected them to be. And, like, politics play a very big role here. And I just have to, like, sort of learn more about this. And in the meantime, I lost friends. I remember asking, some students, like, can you just explain to me why this email from Christakis was bad. What do you disagree with specifically? And then they would just like, just completely shun me for even asking the question, and a couple of experiences like that. And yeah. Mhm.
Did you detect any gradient in the way that people reacted to that email? And I'll explain to the listeners just in a moment what it was. But were the younger students more likely to be offended by it than the older students, or
Huh.
was it uniform?
That's interesting. I don't recall interacting with like, first year students or freshmen. But, so the people that seemed particularly upset, to me at least, seemed like older students. The grad students in subsequent years, I wasn't interacting with many grad students that first semester I was there, but later on, that became like a conversation piece for my remaining years on campus. And the grad students were like very much like on the side of, you know, like the social justice wokeness is good kind of thing. So yeah, it seemed like there was a maybe a sort of noisy correlation between being older and being sort of more in favor of sort of implementing social justice
Right.
policies.
For the listeners, this was an incident that happened, I guess, 2015 at Yale.
Hmm.
And Nicholas Christakis was I don't know if they still use this word, but I guess he was the master of Silliman House or Silliman Residential College. Is that the right
Well, that was the
designation?
right term. There was a lot of changes in the subsequent years. They changed master to head of college, but he was the master, and he was, yeah, when he stepped down, they were still using that term.
So Yale is organized into residential colleges, and so each residential college is actually its separate kind of little kingdom. In the case of Silliman, it's got a wrought iron gate that you have to have the right kind of key card to get in. And I was a fellow of Silliman, so I used to always go through that courtyard to have lunch because it was the closest college to the physics building. So that's why all the physics professors were fellows of Silliman. And so that's why it was quite jarring to me to watch this YouTube video of these students castigating Christakis and his wife. And the whole incident started because I think some people had been wearing quote inappropriate or quote offensive costumes on Halloween. And somebody in the higher administration had sent out some kind of email warning students to not wear inappropriate or, offensive. And by offensive, we mean like maybe containing some kind of ethnic or racial caricature
Cultural
aspect,
appropriation.
cultural appropriation.
Hmm.
And what happened is that was it Erica Christakis, the wife of the then master of Silliman,
Hmm.
wrote an email kind of, I think actually, on very principled grounds and in a very sensitive way, questioning whether the administration should be regulating Halloween costumes of Yale students. And I think that was the thing that blew up into a huge
Yeah.
crisis.
It was
Is that fair?
incredible. Yes, that was, yeah, that was an accurate, yeah. I mean, it was incredible what happened. Just the level of coverage it got. I mean, back then it was bewildering to me because, like, I don't know, everyone kind of knows, like, oh, Yale, it's this famous university. But like the fact that I'd open up my Facebook page or something, and like undergrads and like everyone affiliated with Yale was like sharing New York Times articles, The Atlantic, like every single like legacy media outlet like had some kind of take on what was happening on campus, and it was just, yeah, unbelievable. Yeah, that was I guess, yeah, the early days of what we now kind of see regularly, these kind of campus controversies and cancellations or attempted cancellations or whatever. And so, yeah, that was an extremely like dark period, I think, for the university. And I mean, yeah, it was just shocking how quickly people seemed to, yeah, I mean, people who I before that I thought were reasonable, open minded, and thoughtful were very much either for firing these professors, or at the very least like neutral and wouldn't stand up for it. Like very few people were willing to actually say like this is wrong and we don't agree that people should be fired, and that that the university is fundamentally racist, or that Peter Salovey should denounce the email and the Christakises. So just the level of like cowardice was pretty unreal.
As I mentioned, it had particular resonance for me because the video of him being attacked, well, verbally attacked by these students or disrespected by these students, that courtyard was very familiar to me. And secondly, my father used to tell me when I was growing up, the Cultural Revolution was actually going on in China when I was growing up. And
Mm.
my father would tell me all these stories of things that were happening to his family because his family was still in China and they were from a kind of elite background. So they suffered a lot during the Cultural Revolution. So this idea that students in particular could go crazy and, abuse people who maybe didn't deserve the abuse was very vivid in my imagination from my childhood. So when it happened at Yale, I made that connection immediately. And maybe nowadays I think you're considered a right winger if you want to equate these kind of woke campus protests with the Cultural Revolution in China. But that connection just spontaneously occurred to me just on seeing the video.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, at that point, I had no familiarity with what had happened during the Cultural Revolution, but since then I've read a bit about it, and I can see some of the parallels. And yeah, just the ability for a handful of students. I mean, it was a numerical minority of students. I mean, I would say the vast majority of the students were probably neutral. Like they didn't really care one way or the other. It wasn't like a big. They didn't have a strong opinion on it. And so this sort of strident minority of students, small group, managed to create this feeling of discomfort on campus to the point where no one was willing to speak out. And they were, whatever. They were half successful, right? Like Nicholas and Erica did step down from Silliman. Erica withdrew from teaching altogether. And Nicholas, he still teaches and does research there, but they were sort of half successful in their aims. And yeah, it was just unbelievable to me. Like to this day, I still don't quite understand how like a group of undergrads can wield so much power and how like an administration like a university administration, one of the top universities in the world, and the faculty could all be just so timid in response to like a bunch of 20-year-olds. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah, it's I mean, I could comment on that,
Yeah.
having been a senior administrator. The issue is that the people who make it to that level are primarily careerists,
Hmm.
and they don't want to risk their careers to stand up on principle.
I see.
And there's just a complete lack of courage, I think, on the part of most administrators
Hmm.
at universities.
Yeah.
So it's
That
pretty sad.
that makes so much sense. I remember I had this conversation with a professor about 2 years after those events, and he said that he tweeted something and basically in like this sort of very vague general statement in support of freedom of speech. And I mean, it's very easy to interpret a post like that. He tweeted this around like during the period of the protests. So he tweeted in 2015 something in favor of free speech, and he told me that he got this immediate backlash, comments on the tweets from Yale undergrads saying, how could you do this? We thought you were, on our side. We thought you were one of the good ones. He was getting these nasty emails. And he was telling me how much this hurt him. And, at the time, I just sort of nodded politely. But in my mind, I was thinking to myself, like, how is it possible that, like, a professor at Yale would care about, like, oh, you get a couple of nasty emails and some mean comments on Twitter, but you're a professor, you have tenure, like you should be able to say what you want, right? And yeah, I think there's just this, yeah, the careerist, maybe a sensitivity, just yeah, it really was confusing for me.
One of the things I tell my students or, guys who are working at my startup or something and who might be trying to model like how government works or how some big corporation that they're negotiating a deal with works is you always have to look at the individual incentives. There might be some stated quote purpose or mission of the greater institution, but in fact, what really happens is determined by individual incentives. So you
Mm.
have to say, what's Salave's incentive for making a strong stand here? He could take on a lot of trouble if he is wrong footed, whereas it's much easier for him just to kind of give in to the students. And unless there's a countervailing group like alums or rich donors or federal government trying to force him to do quote the right thing or the other thing, it's much easier for him just to kind of give in.
I have a friend. He's a naval officer now, but he used to work at alumni reunion events as a server to make a little extra money on the side. And he told me that whenever he worked at these events, Salave would spend about half the time sitting at tables with wealthy alums trying to convince them that there was no free speech problem on campus because that was all they wanted to talk about was what the hell's happening here at this
Yeah,
university. And Salave's like,
yeah.
"Oh, it's all fine. It's all good." Like basically trying to convince them not to pool their donations.
Yeah, I think it's a big generational thing because even if you're like myself, I was a center left person, am a center left person, and a big, like, for example, Obama supporter. But I'm very concerned about freedom of speech, freedom of expression on campus. And, I've stopped giving money to Caltech over this. And, I would guess most Yale alums are the same way. They would, my age, would say, yeah, I'm very concerned about the intellectual climate on campus. But then it's Solove's job to just smooth them out
Hmm.
and kind of convince them it's not a problem, even if it is a problem, because he can't solve it.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
And it's very similar to why in the military, I don't know how many Marines or special forces guys you associated with in the military, but think how gung ho those guys were and how serious they were about war fighting. And just imagine like somebody comes along and says, well, now we're going to just remove the fitness, the 60-kilogram backpack, forced march requirement to become a Marine or special forces combatant because we need more gender equality. And you can imagine these hardcore guys are going to say, no way. I don't, I think you need, upper body strength to be a Marine, or I think you need the ability to carry that 60 kilograms up that hill to be a Marine. But the guys who feel that way just don't get promoted.
Hmm.
And the ones who don't make the waves, they're going to get promoted. And so when you
Uh,
have career competition for, fewer spots than there are aspirants, then you're going to get people who just kind of, do whatever they think the prevailing condition is. They're just going to blow with the wind, and they're the ones who are going to get promoted.
I see.
So, and the hardcore guys who say, no, this is really going to cause problems with our warfighting capability, those guys are gone. They're out. So it's the same thing at the university. If you're very adamant that, just to take an example, someone like Charles Murray should be allowed to come on campus, even if that if you disagree with him, we should argue against him and use facts against him. But if that's a very unpopular position and you're the associate dean and you're the only associate dean that stands up for that, you're the associate dean that's not going to become a dean,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah.
that's that's what's actually happened at our universities.
That makes sense. I mean, I remember after the fact hearing that, during the Silliman Courtyard event with Nicholas when he was, being denounced by all these students, that there were actually like faculty and administrators in that crowd too, like silently and passively watching as, all these students were yelling at Nicholas and none of them did anything. And yeah, I guess like from a careerist point of view, running the cost benefit analysis, there's, very, very little upside, at least within that organization, to draw negative attention on yourself and take a stand against, against the students. And for whatever reason, I guess we've all sort of collectively agreed that if you're, if a group of 19-year-olds is angry enough, then they must be right.
Yeah, it's funny as an administrator, I always felt because we would have quarterly or maybe every 2 months, we'd have the board of trustees meetings where the senior administrators would meet with the board of trustees of the university. And it was part of the meeting was public. So that the general public and students could come and express whatever sentiments they wanted. And so there were often protests over various issues that happened in this big boardroom, at the
Mm,
university. And I used to always have mixed feelings. Like part of me would say, oh, it's kind of annoying that they're disrupting this meeting. But then on the other hand, I would say, well, I mean, when I was young, I wanted to protest against, whatever apartheid or this or that. And it's good that young people are idealistic and maybe they're a little unrealistic in their idealism, but it's natural. It's good. It's part of being in college that you express your political beliefs and you protest against things that you disagree with. So I was always of mixed feelings. Like I was annoyed that I was inconvenienced by what they were doing, but then I always used to say like, well, but it's a good thing in general in society that we allow this. But then I always thought that the senior people should have the courage of their convictions and say, if I disagree with the position of these students, I'm not going to knuckle under to it. But
hmm.
that's the part that seems to be a little bit absent these days. I think mainly because of just careerism, just because people don't want to stand up for their principles and just would rather do what's convenient for their own personal advancement.
Yeah. Yeah, that helps to make sense of a lot of what's going on. Yeah, not just with universities, but with yeah, I mean, even in the military, there's a lot of interesting changes occurring with fitness standards and gender equality and so forth. I mean, it's sort of creeping everywhere in corporations too. That
It
yeah,
doesn't even have to
careerists.
be it doesn't even have to be woke stuff. It could even be weapon systems. Like if you're a critic of the F-35 and you say, well, this cost way too much and it doesn't actually do what they promised, but if you're a general and you oppose the program too much, you still could get cashiered because you know Lockheed Martin is very politically powerful, and the senators supporting the program are very powerful. So even there, you might have some principled view on things, but be very afraid to assert it, even if it's for the good of the country, just because it's not good for your career.
Right. Yep. Yeah. That's sort of what is that? Yeah. I mean, yeah, just a sort of misaligned incentives. So that makes
Yep.
sense.
I want to come back to the state of higher ed because I know
Mm.
you're involved with the University of Austin, and which is, I think, maybe an alternative model that emphasizes freedom of expression and ideas and things like this. But before we leave the wonderful environment of New Haven, I wanted to ask you, because I heard you mention this in another interview. So you talked about your Twitter experience while you were in New Haven, and how if you put the geographical restriction, so it's mainly students
Oh,
and
Tinder,
Yale.
Tinder, right? Not Twitter.
Oh,
Tinder. Yeah.
well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Did I say Twitter? I meant Tinder. Sorry about that.
Right.
Yeah, no, Tinder. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Maybe you could repeat what you said about the difference between what you find on Tinder if you stay really close to the campus versus if you broaden out to the rest of New Haven.
Yeah. Well, so this wasn't actually, so a friend of mine was describing his experience using I think it was Tinder. It wasn't actually in Yale in New Haven. It was at another elite university, but in a kind of a similar situation where the university itself was extremely affluent and the students came from, wealthy backgrounds, but the surrounding area was very much the opposite, sort of run down and stricken by poverty. And he told me that when he put his Tinder radius to, I think it was like 1 mile, just basically right around the campus, and he would look at the profiles of the female students, he said, like, a large percentage of them had, poly or, open relationships or, casual, basically like, championing sexual freedom and these kind of things in their bios. And then when he extended the radius to like 5 or 10 miles just outside of the university to encompass, the rest of the town and its outskirts, he said that about half the women he saw on Tinder were single moms, and it was the same age group, right? Like I think he had it at, college age, 18 to 22. And for the 18 to 22-year-olds who are studying at a top university, they're poly, casual, open, and then the 18 to 22-year-olds who aren't in a university, who are living in rundown neighborhoods, they're have, children without fathers present, perhaps multiple children with multiple different fathers. And so sexual freedom looks different depending on your social class and your sort of background and life experiences.
Right. So one of the things I find interesting about you is, you're still very focused on class, which, in previous generations, many social analysts were focused on class. I mean, Marxists, for example, whereas now things are very focused on racial identity and things like this. And this difference is, I think in this case, probably primarily a class difference, although I guess there could be some racial aspects as well. But is this the thing that led you to formulate the idea of luxury beliefs? This kind of the idea that sexual freedom could be, okay for certain elite groups, but maybe have a lot of damaging consequences for people that are not from the elite social class?
I mean, that was one experience that informed my idea of luxury beliefs. There were some others. I mean, I met multiple students, for example, who would, on the one hand, they would say that they thought that marriage and monogamy were outdated, and like marriage itself was this sort of oppressive patriarchal institution. And then, then when I'd ask them about their own family background, they would tell me, they were raised by both of their birth parents. And then I'd ask them what they plan to do in their own future. And they would say, oh, I plan to have a family, basically like get married, settle down and have kids and follow that sort of traditional, typical model of marriage that they themselves had been raised in. And then I would sort of question further and ask, well, then why are you saying marriage is outdated and, we should move beyond it? And they would say, well, I mean, just because that's my personal preference, that shouldn't have to be imposed on anyone else, and that marriage does have these patriarchal roots, and that it's not right that we should try to impose it on all of society. And so enough interactions like that where people would sort of live one way and experience the benefits of sort of one kind of lifestyle, but then promoting a very different one. That was what led me to come up with the idea of luxury beliefs. And then in addition to that, in addition to these personal experiences and interactions. I was reading at this time, this was like my final year of Yale. I mean, I didn't coin the term luxury blues and start writing about it until 2019, but basically the 2018, 2019 period, I was reading a lot of like Thorstein Veblen, The Theory of the Leisure Class, his sort of, satirical book lampooning the upper class of his time in the late 19th century. And I was reading Bourdieu and his idea of social distinction and cultural capital, and Paul Fussell's book Class: A Guide Through the American Status System. And a lot of these guys, like Bourdieu, was himself like a pretty hardcore Marxist, and so yeah, a lot of the class analysis came from the left. But I didn't care, I didn't have any kind of a partisan bias. I was just looking for interesting thinkers who were commenting on these kind of class divides, and a lot of it helped me to make sense of what I was seeing at both Yale and Cambridge, and how by like the sort of this punchline of the ideas that luxury beliefs have replaced luxury goods.
I'm really glad to see you mentioning Bourdieu because I really feel like he's underappreciated in the Anglophone world. Like, there's some people academics who appreciate French theory would know who Bourdieu is, but by and large, I think most American intellectuals don't know who Bourdieu is or aren't familiar with his work. And when I first read it quite a while ago, it actually helped me understand the dynamics of academia because he analyzed French academia in great detail and even the lineages of who advised who and who studied with whom and all these things. And he pointed out that the main thing academics are competing for is the power to consecrate.
Hmm.
So if you become a super influential academic in your field, anything that you are interested in suddenly becomes consecrated as an important idea and worthy of effort by other people. And that's in the era of when I was coming up as an academic, string theory was very prominent in theoretical physics. And I could see that Bourdieu's model for how these things work perfectly describe how string theory became like the trendy, hot thing for theoretical physicists to study.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I'm a big fan of Bourdieu, and I think any academic in America who wants to understand how academia works should read a little bit of Bourdieu.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these sort of fashionable trends, yeah, like his idea helps to illuminate, yeah, a lot of what you see in academia. I mean, I see it in psychology too, where every few years people, like the dominant sort of thing people were interested in studying from like 2016 onwards was like, how did Trump get elected, and like trying to study the psychology of the Trump voter. And then, a couple of years later, it was all about sort of fake news and how like the psychology of people who were susceptible to it. And then, it became about sort of misinformation. So you sort of see these patterns and these trends depending on, what's fashionable, and yeah, whether the sort of highest status members of the community consecrate those civic research ideas and topics.
Now, in your idea of luxury beliefs, the idea is that these are beliefs which, maybe are false. They're not true descriptions of how the world works or what's best for people. But if you are well off enough, i.e., you have the luxury of holding these beliefs, they don't harm you. In fact, they may help your social status.
Yeah,
Is that a
so
fair?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I
Go
define luxury beliefs as ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. Yeah, so I mean, the beliefs themselves, they're not necessarily reflective of reality. Sometimes they can be, but they're more so sort of expressions of preferences. And so, I gave the example earlier about like championing sexual freedom and sort of eroding the underpinnings of monogamy and romantic relationships, and the example of marriage and those kinds of things. I mean, there are other examples of this as well. I mean, even there are sort of like less, what, like, I guess less overtly political examples too, like spreading addictive technologies, for example, where there are a lot of tech entrepreneurs who will advertise and promote phones or screens or tablets or apps But then, famously, many of these same entrepreneurs will not allow their kids to have iPads or use phones or have like, carefully monitor the screen time or send their kids to schools where they're not allowed to use screens. And so, on the one hand, they're sort of obtaining status through amassing a lot of material wealth, while on the other hand, sort of spreading a technology that may not necessarily be beneficial for less fortunate people.
How much of, obviously there maybe this differs across different examples, but for particular luxury beliefs, how much of it is signaling to increase your own status versus just being clueless and, sincerely believing something is true about the world when in fact it's a mistaken belief?
Yeah, I think that a part of it, for the most part, it's probably not deliberate or calculated in any way where people think like, oh, if I say X, then I'll boost my status or something along those lines. But they sort of recognize, almost to what we were speaking about earlier, that if you say certain things, you may thwart your prospects somehow and your reputation. And if you say other things, you can either maintain or boost it. And in the aggregate, this can have harmful and detrimental effects for less fortunate people, for sort of lower income, less educated people. But I think like others, these sort of activists and people who are very interested in sort of shifting culture, they sort of intentionally will take on views that are at odds with conventional opinion in order to sort of signal their distinction and to signal that they were educated at top universities and that they can hold these sort of unusual and peculiar and sophisticated sounding opinions. I mean, I read a book last year called Wasps: The Splendors and Miseries of an American Aristocracy. It's funny, like you think you have like a unique or original idea, and then you start reading, about previous eras, and nothing in like sort of sociocultural commentary is ever really new. And so the author Michael Knox Barrett, he writes about how the WASPs in the early and mid 20th century, even they viewed ordinary Americans as yahoos. That was the term he used, yahoos stuck in moronic darkness. And that many of the upper wasps of that era, they took on causes because they experienced glee at the thought of the vulgarians, reacting with horror. The fact that someone would promote these kinds of ideas or these kinds of policies. So even then, the sort of upper class of that day would engage in this sort of practice of taking on peculiar beliefs, fashionable beliefs, just to sort of stand out from the masses.
Well, to take the example of marriage and two parent families, I think probably you're more familiar with these statistics than I am, but I think that actually among elites, the rate of divorce or the fraction of families that, in which their both parents are present, that hasn't declined at all in the United States, like in the last 50 years, or maybe it's even gone up. Whereas for the lower classes, middle class and below, it skyrocketed. Is that a fair description of the statistics?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these stats have been reported by Robert Putnam at Harvard and Charles Murray too. That basically, if you break down by social class, the family structures for upper and lower class families in the 1960s, it was virtually identical. Less than I think it was less than 5% or about 5% of kids across social classes were born out of wedlock, and the vast majority were raised by both of their parents. And then if you fast forward to 2005, for the upper classes, it had dropped slightly from 95% to 85% of children raised by both of their birth parents. Whereas for the working class and lower class, it had dropped from 95% to 30%. And that's very much sort of in line with my own personal experiences where, I've told this story before, but like there was this moment where I realized just like how different the social environment at Yale was, not just in terms of the sort of economic benefits and just a sort of like overt economic class differences at Yale, because I kind of knew like a lot of these students are going to be rich, but I was in a class and the professor administered this anonymous survey basically asking how many of you were raised by both of your birth parents. And out of 20 something students in this seminar, only me and one other student answered yes. So, more than 90% of the kids in this class were raised by both of their birth parents. And that just stunned me that like, that was, just the fact that so many students were raised in that kind of a home environment, because like literally nobody I knew when I was growing up in my high school had that kind of home life. Like I was familiar with it. I saw it on TV and stuff, but like in terms of reality, that was the first time I'd seen like so many people who had that kind of stable family structure. And so, yeah, then I started digging into the statistics and the data. And yeah, if you look at, like college educated women, the divorce rate for them is like less than 10%. But if you look at women who are high school only, and especially for high school dropouts, it's, well above 50%. And so, we have these, we look at these aggregate statistics of, oh, the divorce rate in America is 40% or 50% or what have you. But if you break it down by class and education, it's completely different. The experience is based on yeah, education, income, and so forth. I remember I had a conversation with a friend recently. He has a master's degree, and he's like, lives in a sort of upper middle class neighborhood. He's in his 40s, and he was telling me, he and his other friends were like, how come none of us are divorced yet? We're all married. We've all been married for more than 10 years, and none of us are divorced. And my friend, he and I talk a lot. So he told his friends, that's because like we're all like educated and upper middle class. Like people in our class strata seldom get divorced. So it's possible that, none of us will ever get divorced. And so like the whole, like, the snapshot statistic of 40% very much does not necessarily apply to, to certain groups.
Yeah, I want to drill down on this a little bit. Now, when I was growing up, and I grew up in a town in the middle of Iowa with a population of like 40 or 50,000 people, and it was a little college town. At that time, I was a little kid in the 70s. I remember that a very small fraction of the kids, like at my elementary school, were children of divorced parents. And people would often, at that time, the whole thing was very stigmatized. People would say, well, of course, Johnny has a behavior problem because he's a child of divorce. It was so unusual and regarded quite negatively in the community I grew up in that, it was quite remarkable. But I always thought, because America was getting more and more liberal over time, that and you would read in the paper that divorce rates were skyrocketing. So I just assumed before I actually saw the official, sort of more explicit statistics about the upper classes, I would have expected, if you had just asked me to make a guess, that the divorce rate was much higher, even among the elites, than it had been when I was growing up. But apparently it hasn't really changed.
No, 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 no. It
And
really hasn't. Yeah.
but what's interesting is that when you talk to other people from elite backgrounds, say my age, like in their 50s, it isn't that, I would say the stigma against divorce has completely vanished. So that if my kid were playing with a neighbor's kid and that kid came from a divorced family, there would be no sense of, oh, we expect that kid to be a juvenile delinquent because, or badly behaved because he's a child of divorce. That whole language and viewpoint is just gone. So there isn't really any stigma. So the question is, why do the elites manage to stay married to each other if it isn't some kind of social stigma that's keeping them in their marriages? It's kind of interesting. It's almost as if they are just maybe better at finding the right partner, or something about the way they do it allows them to stay married, or maybe about their character allows them to stay married. I don't really quite understand it. It's not the social, it's not that the church is forcing them to stay married, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah, I get it. I mean, I think that if you remove the cultural guardrails, a certain subsect of the population will continue to adhere to customs and habits and practices that are advantageous for themselves and for their families and for their children, right? I mean, I mean, it's pretty clear that marriage, in the aggregate, on average, right? Like it's beneficial for children. It's beneficial for adults too, right? To have like a sort of forming a pair bond, stable monogamous marriage, having kids. That's like the best environment for everyone. And if you're, highly educated and have some money and you're sort of aware of, not necessarily of the statistics, but just broadly understanding of the benefits of marriage. And often many of these people themselves came from, I mean, nowadays we're at the point now where like people who get married and stay married today came from stable family homes in their own lives, whereas many of the people getting sort of divorced or never getting married or having, children out of wedlock today came from those kinds of homes, right? Like we're sort of a generation or two removed from it now. So if you're raised in that environment, I think that also helps to have those sort of models to imitate. Whereas I think, like broadly speaking, for most people who are not as fortunate, not as educated, don't have the dispositions and traits that lead to forming a marriage, maybe absence of conscientiousness and so forth, then it helps to have those sort of social pressures in place to guide you to do the right thing and to help you to make decisions that are in the long run advantageous. So yeah, I mean, we completely remove the stigma, and you're right that nowadays upper middle class and upper class people, or the elites, there's no more stigma and no more judgment, and to me that's actually part of the reason why we're seeing a lot of the sort of family breakdown, because those are the kinds of people who get to decide what behaviors are considered prestigious and worth imitating and pursuing. And once they decided that, broadly speaking, family formation is not, generally important for society, family stability is not important, gradually, and they stopped upholding that norm, then gradually, yeah, it sort of had a long term effect on society as a whole.
Now, is this topic the same thing that you're doing for your PhD dissertation, or are you doing something completely different?
No, no, I'm doing something completely unrelated. Yeah, I mean, by my whole public presence and online presence, it was sort of it was not about like promoting my academic work or anything. It was almost sort of an accident. The fact that I managed to get somewhat of a following on Twitter and on Substack, but my academic work, yeah, it's roughly sort of building on Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations theory. My PhD supervisor has worked with him on a lot of the research on sort of the psychology of disgust. So yeah, I'm working on sort of related topics of, how certain kinds of, for example, like individual differences in moral judgments and moral foundations theory. And so right now I'm working on a paper on age and moral judgments. And so, I mean, for, a simple finding that I've consistently found not only in sort of these online studies that we're running, but also in like bigger data sets, the European Value Survey and the World Value Survey, is that consistently younger people are more permissive in their moral judgments than older people. And this has held across time. I mean, we have these sort of studies dating back to 1981. These are cross-sectional studies indicating that across multiple time points, older people basically rate moral violations to be more objectionable than younger people. And, we control for all of these sociodemographic variables, education, income, and so on. And so, yeah, that's the kind of work I'm working on. It's funny, earlier you mentioned that, young people, they tend to be sort of morally idealistic and so on. But actually, I cite a lot of work in this paper I'm working on that indicates the opposite, that actually older people score higher, at least on these sort of scales of moral idealism that psychologists have come up with. That actually young people are less morally idealistic. They tend to be more cynical too. So I think this all kind of fits together. Young people are sort of more morally permissive, less idealistic, more cynical, and so yeah, this is kind of in line with my general thesis project.
I would say, just to clarify what I said earlier, what I meant by that was within their life cycle.
Hmm.
So for a fixed individual, when you're young, you tend to be more idealistic. And then as you get older, you realize you get more cynical and realistic about the world.
I don't know
Um,
if that's true though. I mean, I think like intuitively that makes sense, and I would have agreed with you, but yeah, I guess I'm becoming like a little bit more skeptical. I mean, because if you look at like just generally like even moral behavior, right? Like older people are actually like nicer, they donate more, they're less likely to commit crimes. Like just everything about older people, they seem to be just
well,
like better
I,
than younger people. So yeah.
yeah, I guess there's several aspects to this, but
Mm,
one is that I think there has been a secular trend
mm,
that at this moment in time, the people that are young are different from the people that are old, not just as part of their life cycle, but because the different generations differ
mm,
in, how they were, what values predominated. So there's two different effects here. So if you could like have a bunch of cohorts where you could follow them throughout their entire lives and just see what the gradient is, like, do you become, when you're young, are you more idealistic, and when you are old, are you a little more hard headed?
Yeah.
I think that's a very kind of old bit of folk wisdom.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I think like this is why I looked into these cross sectional studies dating back to the 1980s, and so this is specifically just for moral judgment. But I mean, there are other studies too. So the moral idealism studies, those weren't those not aren't my work, but the dark triad, for example, the dark triad personality traits, those peak. So I think there have been some like longitudinal studies on the dark triad, and those peak in early adulthood and then gradually taper off throughout one's life. And I mean, people who are high on the dark triad, they don't tend to be particularly morally idealistic. So, but yeah, I agree with you too that there's also secular effects. There are probably, in addition to, if there are age effects, but there are also probably cohort effects as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of an interesting question. Basically my whole kind of view of young people has changed quite a bit since doing some of this research, and not necessarily for the better.
have you ever heard this old aphorism? When you are young, if you are not on the left, you have no heart, and when you are old, if you are not on the right, you have no brain. Have you ever heard this?
Yeah, I remember someone said Winston Churchill said it, but I've heard it attributed to others. I'm familiar with the phrase.
Yeah, it's very old, and at least having passed through at least my lifetime, my particular life stream, that rings very true to me because when I think about my peer group and when we were young, we were idealistic and we were more susceptible to believing in kind of leftist utopia and ideas. And then as we've gotten older, we've realized, wow, these market forces are really hard to beat. People, people really are self-interested, and all kinds of observations about human nature gradually take hold, and then you end up sort of being more sympathetic to right of center ideas as you get older. So at least in my peer group, that seems to have been true.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've experienced that in my own life and with my friends. And yeah, I mean, there's interesting data on this. I think it's some of it is a little bit inconsistent, but broadly it seems to point in that direction that people do tend to become more politically conservative over time. And yeah, I think there is something interesting about that. And of course, like I think a lot of more people who are a little bit more cynical would say, well, that's because as you get older, you accrue wealth and you accrue status and you want to hold on to those things and fend off any challengers, and so that's why you become this sort of conservative person because you want to, I mean, retain your power. I don't think that's I think that's a little bit overly cynical. Not that it's totally untrue, but yeah, I mean, I think there is something to this fact, like you tend to become
I,
wiser when you get older, and
yeah,
so.
I think there is definitely something to it because in my just studying my own psychology, it's like after you've been paying taxes for a long time, and once you're in a high income group and you own an expensive house, you start thinking like, what are my tax dollars going?
Yeah,
Whereas
right.
when you're young, you don't think about
Yeah,
you
you
don't
don't pay
pay taxes,
taxes, right? Yeah. Well, there are
but you see
these
the benefits.
I remember
Yeah,
it was really funny. So I was an older student, right? And I was at Yale my first year, and I see these students go off to do their first internship, right? Like they never had to work in high school. Like I had to work in high school. I had part-time jobs. But these kids didn't have to work, but then they go off and like, do their internship at Goldman Sachs or something, and then they'd realize like, oh, like I have to pay, some huge chunk of my summer internship salary is going to taxes. And so there were these like memes going around on Facebook and stuff about like, like pre internship, you're like this, hardcore Marxist, and then post internship, you start reading Ayn Rand and like becoming more of a libertarian.
yeah, and also when you're young and you see a kind of idealistic political leader, whether it's JFK or Obama, you can really buy into the whole thing that you're going to change the world.
Hmm.
But then once you've seen this happen again and again and again, then you know some insider details about, well, what was that administration really like and what did they really do? Then it's much easier to just be cynical and say, well, I'm not going to buy into, you know, it's morning in America or whatever latest thing they're.
But Steve, older people are far more likely to vote than younger people too, right? Like, young people want to change the system or something, but they don't vote, like they don't,
But to me,
yeah.
but they may be voting with a much more like jaundiced eye of what's accomplishable by their
Mm,
vote. Like they may be just voting to like block a reduction in their social security benefits or something,
right.
as opposed to morning in America, we're going to create the utopia now, which a young kid could actually believe is going to happen.
Hmm.
And the old guy is just like, no, let's just not spend more of my tax, but let's not raise my taxes, okay? So
Right.
the internal monologue of why they're going into the voting booth could be different.
Yeah, yeah.
And also you're more conscientious when you're older. So like going to the voting booth on the voting day is easier for you than when you're like a, hormone addled youth
Mm,
or something. So
right.
also on the dark triad stuff, I think the hormone levels play a big role because, when I was a younger guy and I had higher testosterone, all kinds of behaviors where I not only couldn't avoid, I was literally out of my control, like that I would do certain things to like meet girls and, whatever. Now I'm an old guy. I just want to have like a nap or something. So I'm not going to express my dark triad traits very much.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of factors involved here.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that like all of those things definitely play a role, and just like the sort of stage in life. I mean, I think there's a reason why, testosterone peaks. I mean, there's all these sort of evolutionary psychological reasons we don't have to go into, but I think even that is tied into the dark triad to some extent. That if you want to, obtain a partner and obtain some success in your career, and it's just sort of like advance in the world. I think it helps maybe to have like a little bit of that sort of strategic and calculating frame of mind that's often associated with a dark triad. And then once you're sort of settled and established, like you don't necessarily have to, enact or implement dubious strategies or something. You just can kind of, chill out and be a little bit more relaxed. And so, yeah.
I I think that the thing I discover as I age is that to some extent, it's even out of my control. Like I just don't have necessarily the energy to engage in these shenanigans that I might have, like spending all Friday night cruising around clubs and stuff. I just couldn't even do that now.
Yeah.
Whereas it was an imperative when I was 19, I had to do that. So,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
absolutely. I mean, even I feel it now. I mean, when I was in my early 20s or late teens, early 20s going out, I mean, now I would have a hangover and then I just like drink a cup of coffee and have a shower and I'd be good to go. And now like if I have a hangover, like the day is gone, and I'm only 32. So yeah, that's
exactly.
aging. Yeah, that's positive and negative effects there.
You know, I'm kind of the opposite of you. I went through college between the age of 16 and 19, and my hormone levels were so high that I just can't believe I even got through it because my brain would have been on girls the whole time. And it's just amazing I could study physics and get through Caltech at that age. Just, you know, unbelievable.
Yeah.
But
No, no, I think I was the same kind of way. I think a lot of guys, right? Like that's just the natural age. But, there was like what I mentioned before, like there were many aspects of misery to like military life and being stuck on an Air Force base when you're 19 years old is like you're just surrounded by a bunch of other like, desperate 19-year-old guys. And especially you can't drink yet, you're not old enough to drink, you're not allowed to go to a bar, it's just like a lot of drinking cheap beer you sneak in and like playing video games and just like sad that you don't have a girlfriend. Like that's a lot of those early years that I can remember. It's yeah, not necessarily happy memories. But I get it though. Like the military does that on purpose, right? Because they know that like when girls are involved and just guys can do very stupid and reckless things, and so just sort of locking them away and preventing them from getting into trouble. That's sort of how they get the mission done.
yeah. Whereas in our case, we were on a nearly all male campus, but in Los Angeles. So we would get in our cars and spend every Friday and Saturday night trying to meet girls in Los Angeles. So a lot, a lot of the early pickup artist stuff was sort of, I don't want to say completely invented, but a lot of this stuff was pioneered definitely by guys from Caltech in Los Angeles. I don't know if there's any real connection between the modern PUA stuff and the stuff that we used to do, but at least until conceptually, there is a big connection.
Hmm.
So I wanted to ask you about your career goals. Are you hoping to become a professor of psychology, or are you thinking you might leave academia?
I mean, it's funny. I was pretty much set on completely withdrawing from academia. I mean, I just saw too many things. We've gone in depth into what happened at Yale. I saw similar things happening here at Cambridge, and after these events, I was just ready to leave. And then yeah, the University of Austin, this new project launched and they invited me to become a faculty fellow and maintain some role and affiliation with the this new university, and so I agreed to join. And Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with the mission. I mean, the mission, it's funny, the mission they have is the mission I thought that every university had, which is like free speech, open inquiry, prizing truth above all else, and, freewheeling conversations and exploring interesting ideas. And so it's just, it's funny, like, oh, there's a university that I thought that all the universities were going to be like. And so so I have this position with them. Uh, but it's mostly an advisory role, right? Because the university is still, in the preliminary stages. I think we're not going to have undergrads until the fall of 2024, maybe 2025. But in the meantime, between now and then, finishing up my degree program here, continuing to write on Substack, I'm working on a book. I'm writing a memoir based on, my path from foster care and all through the military into higher education and all the lessons I learned along the way, and just going sort of in depth into my most vivid memories of those years and what I took from them. And so yeah, between the book and the Substack and whatever else I comes up on the horizon, that'll sort of occupy maybe the next 2 or 3 years.
So, I mean, University of Austin, I would kind of characterize as a reaction against what traditional academia has evolved into.
Hmm.
And so I'm not surprised that you're involved with that project. I was kind of curious as to whether you would consider, though, traditional academia, like when you
Oh,
finish your
no,
PhD, will you
no
apply for
way.
tradition? Okay, that's my
No,
question.
no, no, not at all. No, I made up my mind on that, I think, but 2 plus years ago. Yeah, I could not imagine. I mean, well, first of all, like, the difficulty of getting in, like, don't get I love research, I love psychology and the stuff that we do, but, the difficulty of getting a decent postdoc is, it's getting harder and harder, and then after COVID, it became, that much more burdensome. And just all of the political climate in the universities, I don't really see that shifting anytime soon. And yeah, I would never I would never stay. And
If
yeah, it's not a good environment, I think, for me. Some people, maybe it's better.
if Jonathan Haidt offers you a postdoc, would you take it?
No, I've actually had offers from, other sort of prominent academics to work in their labs, and I've declined all of them. I would never do it.
Wow, so very principled of you. I admire you. So you're definitely gonna separate from academia after you complete your PhD.
Yeah, I mean, not to say that I'll completely stop doing academic research if interesting projects come up or, collaborators want to work on something and I just sort of remain independent of any particular institution. That's fine, but as far as like actually having, any tie with any, current, university, I just could not. Yeah, I would never do it.
As to your memoir, do you have a contract already? Do you have a publisher?
Yeah, so Gallery Books, it's a imprint of Simon and Schuster. I signed with them and I'm actually in the final stages, so I'm waiting on my editor to get back with some notes, but it's basically, it's just about finished and it should be launching. I think we're tentatively thinking the fall of 23.
That's great. Congratulations on that.
Thanks, Steve.
Just before we started our recording for this interview, I was discussing with you, maybe these are superficial similarities, but similarities between what your memoir might be like and Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance.
Yeah, yeah, I'm aware. I mean, I read the book back shortly after it came out, and I can see like the overlap. And yeah, there's some, the sort of the chaotic childhood and going to Yale and military then Yale, and there's some similarities. And but yeah, I mean, I think that JD Vance, to my knowledge, at least that I can recall, he wasn't in foster care. It was a little bit of a different situation. Yeah, I mean, I think like my book is going to take maybe a little bit of a different perspective on childhood and the education system and general sort of cultural commentary. It's going to take a different point of view.
I think what I found most valuable about your thinking when I, first either read something you had written or heard some interviews with you was, coming from that background, you were much better able to judge what elite culture in America or elite higher educational culture in America has become. You have a sort of outsider's eye, and also you're very insightful yourself. So I think I really look forward to reading your memoir.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Steve. Yeah. I mean, it's been a very interesting last 7 years now. And yeah, I never really intended to have any kind of public presence whatsoever, honestly. I mean, I enjoyed writing. I probably would have done it in some capacity, but yeah, I never really expected to write a memoir so soon. But when I started writing public essays about my early life experiences, and then that in addition to sort of, social commentary, seeing people connect with it and see it help them understand a lot of the sort of cultural trends we're seeing. It's been encouraging.
Now, when you finish up at Cambridge, are you going to move back to this side of the pond, or are you going to stay in the UK?
Yeah, I don't know yet. So in about like 2 weeks, I'll be going to visit my girlfriend's family. I'm meeting them for the first time in Malaysia. So she is Chinese Malaysian. Her family, her ancestors came from China to Malaysia. I think in like the early 1900s. They've settled there for a while, and so be visiting them. She also has cousins in Singapore. So we'll be visiting Singapore too. And, depending on how I feel about, maybe living in Kuala Lumpur or Singapore, I'm open to the idea. If not, then in all likelihood, I'll probably end up in Austin. So it'll either be Southeast Asia or Austin.
Wow, maybe you can bounce back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be ideal.
KL, I've been to KL. KL is a very cool city. It's a lot of interesting things. And I think cost of living is very low there, actually.
Yeah, yeah. We were talking about this, that having an American salary, getting in the Substack bucks, but living in KL would be, it would be very much sort of the dream, right? In terms of cost of living and purchasing power.
It's the digital nomad dream.
Right.
Live in Penang or KL and have a US salary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, hey, I thank you very much for this interview. It's been extremely interesting. And, we're coming up on 2 hours. Is there any last thing that you want to talk about a little bit before we end?
No, I think we pretty much touched on, a lot of the interesting topics we hope to get into. So I think, yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Everybody be on the lookout for Rob's book. Is there a title already, or it hasn't been decided yet?
We haven't decided on a title yet. We have a working title, but yeah, just be on the lookout. I will, make a big public announcement when it's ready for pre-order.
Great. And in the show notes, we'll put links to your Substack and other places where people can find your work.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Steve.